Thank you so much for joining us for another Lunch and Learn. I'm going to hand it right over to Sarah Pulis from Intopia to introduce herself. She's streaming in live from Sydney. So off to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Gee, that sounds wrong. Thanks so much for joining us today. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Sarah, Sarah Pulis, and I'm one of the co-founders and directors of Intopia. So we basically help out organizations to make their digital products more accessible and inclusive. That often does focus on people with disabilities, but we know that when we actually do make our experience more inclusive for people with disabilities, it actually just leads to a better experience for everyone. So really, I like to say, it really is just building a better experience for everyone. On screen, I tried to describe myself. So yes, formally, I am a director. I've said I'm an accessibility avenger because I love talking about accessibility. Usually the word I say, I'm always described by the P word, which is passion. So I do love what I do, and I have been doing that for 13 odd years as well. I am a bit of a jack of all trades when it does come to digital accessibility and inclusive design. Usually, you name it, I've done it at some point in time. And also I am affectionately called by my team the walking WCAG. So WCAG being the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is usually the most common accessibility standard that's referenced. I kind of like to get into the detail of WCAG. So yes, I've been known to be called the walking WCAG, and people call the WCAG hotline, i.e. me, for some advice within my team. Now, as Sarah mentioned, I am joining from Sydney, Australia, and so I would like to start by acknowledging and thanking the Gadigal peoples. That is the land that I am presenting from today, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and also emerging. I'd also love to extend respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating in this webinar, and also people Indigenous to New Zealand as well. All right, so let's get into a bit of a talk around annotations. So pretty much we're going to go through 4 parts today, starting out, what are annotations? Just a little bit of an introduction there. Why use them? It was awesome to see. I think it was roughly around 30% of you are already saying, yes, I'm using them, and probably about another 20 or so are saying sometimes. So hopefully some of this will be a bit familiar to you already. What should we annotate? That proverbial question. And then what's next? So let's start by what are annotations. Interestingly, annotations, I would say, have taken off in some respects, being talked about. There's kits being released and Figma and Sketch and that kind of thing, probably in the last year or so. But actually, I was at a presentation at CSUN, which is one of the big international accessibility conferences, 6 odd years ago now. And it was actually then that I attended a presentation by Jack Nicolai from IBM, who I believe actually was probably one of the first to be talking about annotating designs. At that stage, his team at IBM had developed their annotation system and were using it, and actually spoke about it and at this presentation. So for me, I always, sort of love to go, there's so many people working in this space and who have now released the awesome, toolkits and given advice, but I really do think that they were probably one of the first that actually started in this annotation of accessibility space. When I think about annotations, really at its most broadest, I see it as a way to share your accessibility decisions with the rest of your team. So for me, annotations actually do 2 things. One is that sharing those decisions with the rest of your team, and that could be with your developers, it could be with your testers, it really could be anyone in your team who you want to expose some of that decisions or thinking that you might have gone through as a designer. But the second thing is, I actually think in annotating your designs, you're also have to teach someone else versus maybe if you're just using the knowledge yourself. And in some ways, I feel annotations are the same. In doing those annotations, you need to do those pre-steps of thinking about accessibility as part of your design process, and then how you're communicating those decisions to the rest of your team as well. So very simply, there are lots of different annotation kits around. We will be using our own annotation kit that we have released on Figma in examples today, but ultimately it doesn't really matter what you use or which kit you use or whether you build your own. As long as you're using it in a way that actually works for you and your team, then that's great. Often though, annotation kits, they come as part of something like Figma. The sort of screenshot / mock on screen has the Figma sort of toolbar on the left-hand side, and it has a number of different assets that you can just drag onto your wireframes or your visual designs to actually then show some information. And we'll definitely dig into more about what this might look like and what annotations you might use throughout this presentation. I should mention, I will be monitoring chat. I am monitoring chat. So if you do want to pop anything in chat, whether that's for me or for anyone else that's on the call, please feel free. If it is a question and it happens to fit within what we're talking about right now, I might pick it up. If it doesn't, we'll leave it to the end and pick it up to the end. But do feel free to enter things into chat or ask questions that way as we go. No worries, Dave. All right, so that's just a very brief sort of, what are annotations. So next up, why do we suggest that you use annotations? Well, there's a few things we think of or think, annotations really help with. The first is by using annotations, we're actually using a consistent documentation process to share those decisions around accessibility. So if you've made a decision about something, if you've thought about maybe the keyboard experience and therefore you've actually made decisions around the design and there's certain things you need to communicate for maybe your developers or that kind of thing, then annotations often present this consistent documentation process. The next thing is that common understanding. So once again, what we love in accessibility is, first of all, to address accessibility at the right point in time, and we will talk about that a little bit more in a sec, but then also have communication and collaboration within your teams. We don't want to work in silos. So yes, there are certain things that we say designers should think about when they're looking at accessible design, and the same for developers, for instance, and the like. But at the same time, we want to have that communication and that common understanding between people. So we really feel that those annotations support that common understanding, but also support that discussion process as well. And then lastly, they should be easy to act upon. So when I go through sort of some of the different annotations you can use the ones that are right for you. Use the ones that, have an internal agreement, with others in your team about what those look like so that there is a common understanding. So I mentioned the words, addressing accessibility at the right point in time. Now, I've been part of this industry. I was going to say I'm old enough, but that makes me feel too old. I've been part of this industry for a while. And I do remember back when accessibility was really just seen as a developer's responsibility. Occasionally, you still see organizations or teams who feel like this. But more and more, we're seeing accessibility and that understanding that accessibility actually touches on all parts of the product lifecycle. And this concept of shift left, shifting accessibility, and for that matter, other things, because this sort of is more like a DevOps concept, but shifting accessibility as far left as possible. So if we take a very simple example of use of color, very common in accessible design, that use of color, having good contrast, that kind of thing, it's a really, really common concept that many people know. what we don't want really is to get to the development stage and find that we haven't considered whether the colors we're using are accessible and meet our contrast requirements. That should be done at the design phase. So if it was being done in development phase, we want to shift left. Earlier in that process, we want to address it in design, or maybe even before that in branding and style guides as well. So once again, we feel like annotations also support that shift left concept. So on to that proverbial question of what should I annotate? And I've got a simple philosophy. Annotate what works for your team. We've actually internally to Intopia had quite a few discussions with people in my team. And for a lot of people in my team who now do work in accessibility, they have previous lives in design or development or as user researchers or that kind of thing. So often when we do have these conversations, you know, there's a lot of different views that are being brought together. And we do have a view kind of probably what you should include and annotate within your designs, but ultimately, as long as it's working for your team, that is what is most important. The other thing we find is to not make annotations too onerous. And we've seen all ends of the scale with annotations. We've seen organizations, and you kind of see this reflected in some of the toolkits with the number of like different tags or annotations that the different toolkits have. Some have every single possible, you know, little taggy thing under the sun that allows you to add all sorts of things, including probably things we might actually consider in a developer's responsibility, like actual HTML code. You've got others, and we're probably leaned more towards this, that are a little bit leaner, but also a bit more flexible. So if you do want to go to, you know, an nth degree, you go to it. But if you just want to kind of focus on some particular areas and some particular decisions that you know you need to communicate via your designs, then so be it. So today I wanted to go through 4 categories of suggested annotations. They're broken into the areas of content structure, interactions, accessible names, and UI states, which actually technically aren't an annotation. They're more a documentation or something you include within your designs, but I kind of stretch the boundaries of what an annotation is to include this. These are the things that we feel fall in very clearly into the categories of responsible, sorry, let me start that again. These are the things we feel like are the responsibility and come through either in visual design, UX and or interaction design. And also there's probably a little bit of an element here of content design as well. So if you do have content designers in your team, then they're probably going to be part of this process. Once again, if annotations in terms of using something like Figma or Sketch don't work, just use your own system. I have worked with organizations where, for instance, some of the content design aspects, like, you know, adding labels and that kind of thing, they're like, well, the content designers actually don't have access to Figma or are not familiar with it. So they had a different system to document that information. That's fine. Work with what you, with what works for you. So first up, documenting content structure. Now, first one we have are headings. So documenting headings and their heading levels. This one might feel a bit like a no-brainer, but I can't tell you from a auditing perspective. So when we actually review websites for accessibility against, you know, standards like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, how many times we still see problems with headings and heading levels. So from a visual perspective, you know, headings and heading levels are often represented by typography, size, weight of font, that kind of thing. That gives us our visual hierarchy. But in addition to that, in the underlying code, there needs to be the right markup in order for instance, a screen reader user, as they're reading through content, to hear something like Intopia at ID 24 2021, heading level 1. Or what we do, heading level 2. So it's not just about the way things look, it is also about that underlying structure. Now, if you have a highly templated site and you're always using consistent headings and the way the heading looks maps directly onto the heading and heading level, you might not need to mark up your headings or annotate your headings like this. But once again, I feel like using this system forces you to think about your headings. What are those headings? What are the heading levels? Has each section of content got a meaningful heading that basically acts like a signpost to go, hey, this is what I'm going to find within this content section. So sometimes, again, as I mentioned, it's not just about communicating your decisions, but actually you thinking through your own decisions, and those annotations kind of help with that. So the example on screen, we have a very simple Intopia mock site. This one was the very first presentation that Claire and I did, who I saw Claire actually sign in, so Claire. Yeah, it was just a very simple website where we've got some headings on screen, Intopia ID 24/2021, what we do, and then some tiles that start with accessibility testing, accessibility training, and strategy and consulting. And so we've used our annotation tags in our Figma kit to actually specify what the different headings are. Heading 1, that first heading, heading 2, what we do, and then heading 3, accessibility testing, accessibility training, and strategy and consulting. That first heading 2, the Intopia ID 24/2021, we have actually used 2 font styles there, or font sizes, I should say. And we've just used a little bounding box just to say, hey, when we actually say this is an H1, it's actually the full text Intopia ID 2024/2021, as opposed to just one line or another. So once again, we're kind of adding a tiny little bit of information there, just so there is no ambiguity when it is passed over to developers. Our next content structure element is page regions. So in this case, we want you to document content regions in your template and provide labels when needed. So as designers, you're probably already grouping your information into common regions of a page, header and footer, main content, navigation elements. It's kind of just bread and butter for a designer. But once again, from a coding perspective, we want to convey that same information, that this part here, this is our header, and this part here, this is our footer. Because once again, a screen reader or other assistive technology users can actually navigate to those common regions of a page, so they can say, yep, take me directly to that header section, or take me directly to that footer section, or take me directly to that navigation. Now, once again, when we talk about this, there is a bit of underlying accessibility knowledge here, and I don't have reams of time to go into it, so I'm just kind of skimming the surface of this. But when you are sort of setting up your templates, and this is probably something you'd only do once, if you're using the same common templates over and over, you don't need to redefine your regions every single time because you are using that sort of common template. But when you are doing that initial design, we would suggest that you do identify those regions. So we've got our page, once again, at the very top, we have our header area. So we've just used a bounding box within Figma, and we've got a little annotation there, which is a number 1. And then on the side, we actually have some information that says this is a landmark or a page region, and its type is header. And we've got others on the page. Number 2, same annotation, it's search. Number 3, same annotation, it's navigation. And then number 4, that's specifying our main content area. You will notice on the 3rd region, navigation, it also has a little note against it, has the type of navigation, but it also has an accessible label of site. So when we actually have multiple regions of the same type, and navigation or nav is one of the really common ones, we often do have multiple navigation regions on a page. We actually, good practice is to give it a label. So from a screen reader perspective, when they hear it, they will hear site navigation rather than just navigation, navigation, navigation. So once again, that's something that you can add to your annotations so that when your developer picks it up, they can just go, yep, okay, I know exactly what this is. This is a navigation region and it's got a label of site. And from a developer's perspective, they should know then how to actually do that within the HTML markup. The last part of content structure I wanted to touch on was content order. So document the order that content should be presented to assistive technologies. So very commonly, the order of content generally is that sort of flow, left to right, top to bottom. The first item is pig and pepper. It then has a number of tags and then has some description and then a link. Now, if I was a screen reader user, so I couldn't see, so I think we probably need to move on. So let's say, long story short, if you feel like that the order in which, say, information is read out to the screen reader is different to that visual order, then this is where annotations come in. You can use, say, numbered annotations, which we've used on the screen, to sort of say that actually we want the heading to be read out, then we want the date to be read out, even though visually it's above the heading, and then the rest of the content below the heading. Not necessarily saying this is best accessibility practice, but it's a good example of where, you might actually use annotations like this. All right, so on to documenting interactions, and in particular, keyboard interactions in this case. So next up, we have documenting the keyboard navigation within components. So if anyone's a keyboard user, I tend to be a bit of a power user. So I've got one hand on the mouse, but I might be switching to the keyboard and back. You'll know that there are certain keys that you use in order to, navigate a website. You would tab to different items. When, for instance, you get to maybe a series of radio buttons, you actually tab to the radio button and then you use the arrow keys up and down in order to use those radio buttons. So there's a whole lot of standard keystrokes that we use in order to navigate with a keyboard. And of course, some people actually have to navigate with a keyboard. They might not be able to use a mouse. So we want to get that keyboard interaction right. So once again, this is one of those things that we feel is, sits with or starts at least with design. There's definitely things we need to do on the implementation side, but we want to actually think about like we do for any type of interaction design, we actually want to think about our keyboard interaction. So I would suggest for keyboard interaction, if you are just using standard components, you might not actually need to document the keys that you're using for those components. So if, it's a standard radio button, as I mentioned, don't mess with don't mess with the standard, just use the standard. If you do, though, have custom components or the like, first of all, be very careful when you create those as well, because sometimes, if you're creating either custom components or the word I love that Microsoft coined was Francomponents, when we kind of bolt together 2 or 3, sort of standard components together to make this Francomponent. Do be careful of those in the first instance, but if you do happen to have a custom component, this is where you might use annotations to show how you interact with a keyboard. So we have a menu button here. It's just a button, and when I open it, I have a number of menu items. So my annotations have specified that I can open the menu using Enter or space. Then I would use my arrow keys up and down to actually navigate up and down those menu items. And also we've got a few bonuses. I could use the escape button to close that menu. I could also use the home key in order to move to the first menu item, or the end key to move to the last. Now, once again, I probably wouldn't do this every time. If you've got a lovely design system and a component library, just document this once so it's clear for everyone and then move on. Annotations is all about cutting down on the amount of work and not, doing extra work if you don't have to. So tightly coupled to keyboard is your focus or tab order. So as I mentioned, if you're a keyboard user, you're probably used to, you hit tab and it should move to the next focusable element. So an element that you can actually interact with. We want to be able to document that tab order as well as we go through the screen. So tab order should be predictable and logical. And, as we go through, we might want to say, yep, we start here, then we go there. This is the order in which we tab through the screen. Right, next up is what I've called accessible names, but what fits under here includes text alternatives for images, but also what we might provide for instance, a link that doesn't have a text label on screen. So this is kind of a bit of an accessibility word of accessible name, but it should become clear what they are through the examples if you're unfamiliar with it. So first of all, text alternatives for images. So anytime that we have an image, if it's an informative image, it should have a text alternative that basically describes the purpose of the image. If it's decorative, it should be ignored by a screen reader or other assistive technologies. So when we do have informative images, we want to be able to provide that information about what that text alternative is. Once again, our developers can then pick that up. They're like, right, I've got an image here. This is my text alternative. I just need to code it. There's no additional information that I need. I don't need to make up the text alternative. I don't need to go back to anyone else and ask about the text alternative. I've got all the information that I need. So as an example, Intopia, we have a pets channel because of course we have lots of cute pets. And the example here is 5 different pets that we have. 2 whippets, 1 Scotty, I think it is, 1 lab, a cat, and a German Shepherd. And we've just used our numbered annotations, so 1 through 5, to say, okay, here's number 1. And on the right-hand side, we're using our notes to say this is what the text alternative is for number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. So once again, easy sort of way of documenting that. Identifying decorative images are just as important as informative images, but you might have an internal rule that actually says, unless if I haven't specified a text alternative, then just assume it's decorative. Or if you want to be explicit, maybe you want to actually develop some sort of system to say, this is a decorative image versus this is an alternate one. Here's my text alternative. Again, really up to you as long as you have a common system that everyone understands. So we were just talking about how best practice is if you are using a link, having, and it has an icon, for instance, having an icon and a text label on screen is the most accessible, but I am quite resigned to the fact that that's not always going to happen. So if we do have icon only links like social media links where on screen we've got the Facebook icon, the Twitter icon and the LinkedIn icon, we want to provide alternatives for that. So we want to basically, again, from an assistive technology perspective, we want to go, what would be the label on screen for something like this? Because that's going to be important for our assistive technology users. So for Facebook, we might say Intopia on Facebook, because the context here is it's an Intopia site, of course. For Twitter, Intopia on Twitter, or for LinkedIn, Intopia on LinkedIn. So once again, providing that information, make sure that that is coded by our developers. And then lastly, documenting UI states. So as I mentioned, this is actually kind of less about annotation and more about what you might include as you design your different, say, components. So for this one, we want to document all the different states for our UI components. So things like our focus state, our hover state, our selected state. Examples on screen, we have 9 buttons. The buttons are in 3 different brand colors, orange, teal, and pink. But then we have the different states. So our static state is button just sits there on the screen. We're not doing anything with it. We then have our hover state and we show what changes to the design and to the button design happen when I hover over it. And the same with focus, which generally is more for keyboard only. So hover usually means mouse. Focus state is usually for a keyboard. So I've tabbed to these buttons. And in this case, we do have different styling for the hover versus the focus state. In particular, though, that focus state is really important and something that is very commonly overlooked. We want to make sure everything has a focus state. We also want to make sure that as I tab to it, any color change still meets our minimum contrast requirements. So we basically want it to be easy to see. So there's a bit that goes into the different sort of hover and focus states. So someone mentioned about mobile devices. So first of all, if you're accessing a mobile website via, say, a Bluetooth keyboard, then those focus states are still going to apply. The hover states, though, generally don't, because you're not using a pointer device. Usually it's more like a tap state. So that's a little bit different, but you can sort of tease that out within your design system. For mobile apps, usually the outlines are pretty set. They're kind of inherited from the actual operating system. So there's probably less to do if you're thinking mobile app space. You still want to make sure they're there if someone uses a keyboard, but they're probably not going to be custom. Same with selected states. So checked and unchecked, and all the things that happen when I, hover over a unchecked checkbox. That's very hard to say, or a checked checkbox. What happens in those different states? The same with keyboard focus. So what happens when I tab to an unchecked checkbox versus a checked checkbox? In this case, there's no real difference, but you do sometimes find that there are combinations you have to account for. And error messaging is a really good one, where you might actually want to make sure you're accounting for all those different states. So we have a text box here in its static state, in its focus state, which just has an outline around it that's in orange. It then goes, though, into an error state. So we have actually changed the outline of the text box to red, and it's got a red error state. But what happens when I tab to it? So it's focus plus error. So once again, think of all those different combinations. There's actually probably a lot more that does go into this style of sort of design. But I tell you, if you get your design system right and, get some of these things documented, and then once you've done it, you can almost set and forget, because you've done all that thinking up front, and it just rolls through the work that you're doing. So what would I suggest next for anyone, particularly, I guess, who might not have dabbled in annotations before? So first of all, start small. Oh, there we go. There's my little icon. I'm waiting for it to come through. So yes, start small. You don't need to suddenly, switch on every single annotation. Maybe either pick one maybe that that you're having difficulties with. Maybe that perhaps there's miscommunication in heading levels. So perhaps heading annotations might be the one that you start with. Also have a go. Don't worry too much. We often find with accessibility, there's a lot of fear of getting it wrong. And that is for everything. But what we would suggest is just have a go at doing an annotation, work with the team, and maybe include it in your retros. So say, hey, how did these annotations work that we've just introduced? Was there a clear understanding between all parties? Did they actually help, or was there some information missing? And also, I think, lead the way. What we find with accessibility is that often it takes individuals and champions within organizations to actually sort of stand up and go, hey, let's do something or try something, or that kind of thing. So, just lead the way and actually, start to have give it a go. Well, we finally got through without any more drops, although I guess we've still got about 10 minutes to go before we find that out. I have just popped my email address on screen. It is sarah@intopia.digital, so feel free to reach out. There's lots of other channels, LinkedIn and what have you, so choose the channel that works for you, but email at least is nice and clear.